Hello there, this is ETV Special Edition and I'm Sintayo Tamarat with this edition. With this edition, I'll try to focus on climate change and variability in the Eastern Africa countries and particularly in Ethiopia. And our globe is just witnessing climate change and variability and its adverse effects. And this has a great many consequences on agricultural production and productivity. So to talk on these issues more, I'm joined here by Dr. Teferi Dejene, who is senior researcher at International Livestock Research Institute and also Norway Climate Research Center. Thank you so much for joining me and do stay tuned. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Teferi.
Thank you for hosting me.
Okay, so as I just mentioned earlier, we are going to talk on the climate change, climate variability and its consequences, particularly on developing countries and specifically in East Africa and Ethiopia. So our planet is witnessing the adverse consequences of climate change, and when it comes to the African continent is one of the huge recipients of these climate change consequences. So what manifestations of climate change have you observed in the Eastern African region in general and Ethiopia in particular?
Thank you so much. As you have well stated it, global community has already witnessed a change in climate. When it comes to East Africa, or particularly even in Ethiopia, we have been looking into the different patterns or changes for the last few decades. For example, how the temperature has changed in the region, whether there has been any increment in temperature, and how the rainfall pattern has been in the region, and so on. So for us, we have looked into those patterns, and we can see that the temperature has been increasing almost throughout the region in East Africa, in some areas even much, much higher than expected. And on the other hand, when it comes to extreme events, such as drought, flood, heat waves, and so on, there has been occurrences of very frequent extreme events in the region. For example, for the last almost 5 seasons in East Africa, particularly Kenya, Uganda, and some parts of southern Ethiopia, has experienced a severe drought, causing even deaths of some cattle and so on. So one of the witnesses that we have seen in the region is the frequency and intensity of extreme events increased for the last few decades. And like I said, temperature has also increased, but also we saw patterns of irregular or erratic nature of the rainfall. What I mean by that is, for example, the onset or the beginning of the season in some areas has also changed. And I can give you a good example. For example, in Ethiopian case, people used to benefit a lot from the bulk rainfall, especially regions in the southern Tigray, eastern parts of Amhara, and some parts of central parts of the country used to get rainfall during the bulk season, and they used to grow crops and so on. But the rainfall pattern, especially in the bulk season, has diminished. And those areas we used to grow or benefit from the bulk season are not getting it anymore. So there is a seasonal shift. And even this year, particularly, we can talk about this year as well. If you look into the central part of the country, for example, the bulk and the cramped rain has merged in this country. Very unusual things are happening. So in general, what we have seen is, in East Africa, including Ethiopia, extreme events has increased quite a lot. They are happening quite frequently, and their intensity is also becoming very, very high. And there has been also high climate variability in the region, particularly like the onset of the season, cessation of the season, and the number of the growing season or the growing spell has diminished in some areas. So we have been looking into these patterns for the last few years. So there is quite a change in our region and also in Ethiopia as well.
Okay. So, as you said, you've been just looking into this issue for some years now, and what do you think are the short and long-term impacts of climate change on the region entirely and in the Ethiopian?
One of the impact is on agriculture, of course, because the economy in most sub-Saharan Africa, including Ethiopia, is mainly dependent on agriculture. And the agriculture is more of rain-fed. And so if you have any abnormality in the rainfall pattern, that has a direct impact on the agriculture production and so on. So one of the things that you look into is how does this change in climate is impacting the agriculture sector? Because this has, like I said, the livelihood, the food security, and all kinds of issues related to life is highly dependent on agriculture. And for a reason that the agriculture is highly dependent on rainfall, so this change on climate, particularly on the rainfall, has a direct impact on crop production and so on. And also, if you look the water availability, especially on the lowland areas, like areas which are very much dependent on livestock in pastoralist areas. So the water availability is key in those areas. So with the changing climate, and if there is no any water availability in the region, it has direct impacts on the lives of livestock and so on as well.
Yeah, we can also just witness that over the past 3 or 4 years, Ethiopia has just lost huge resource of livestock due to drought, and it is just directly related with climate change.
Yes, I mean, this is obvious. One manifestation of climate change is climate variability. That means with the changing climate, what we have witnessed is high variability of the seasons, and like I said before, drought years has become very frequent. So I think that is the impact that has caused, a loss of life on the livestock and so on as well.
Well, so you have just given us a very good impression of consequences of climate change in the long and short term. So what measures should be taken to mitigate these climate change consequences?
Well, the first thing we always say is before we even prescribe a medicine, we have to know the problem. Before even we suggest any kind of solutions, what are actually the risks in different regions, at different agroecological zones. And so that is one of the things what we have been doing is there are climate risks, and the risks are different on different regions. Drought could be a risk on maybe southern and southeastern parts of the country. Maybe that is not the problem over the northwestern part of the country. So the first thing we have been doing so far was what are actually the risks in that specific area. And then based on that, we have been suggesting different adaptation mechanisms or interventions to combat those risks. So for us, for example, we looked, for example, for the livestock sector, what are the main climate stressors? Is it heat stress in that region? Is it flood? Is it drought? And also the same thing for later with crop production, we analyzed different kinds of risks associated with climate. Another thing we looked at is actually what we call suitability. We have been doing some suitability maps. These are based on climate data, socioeconomic data, and agronomic data. What does that mean is, for example, will the teff growing areas now, or the wheat growing areas, or the maize growing areas, will they continue to grow maize in the future? Or will there be any shift in those areas where they grow teff or wheat or maize? So we looked into how the suitable areas would change in the future based on different climate scenarios. So we always consider, there are about 4 scenarios we consider. We focus mostly on the 2 of them. One scenario is, what if no change will happen on the greenhouse gas emission globally? Okay, that means if no action is taken by the UN or by the international community, what would be the consequence of that? How does the temperature would increase, and how does that impact the agriculture, the livestock, the water, the health in the different sectors? The second scenario we always look is, what about if the action brings some change at some point of time? And that is our hope, that with all these kinds of negotiation going on globally at the UN level, then we hope that some level of actions will be taken that curb the emission of greenhouse gases. So with that scenario, how does the temperature would change? And what would be the consequence of climate on the different sector as well? So we have analyzed, we have looked into those patterns, and we make suggestions. We work very closely with national and regional partners to do and to coordinate our work so that effective actions will be taken to combat any kind of disasters that would come because of climate change. We work, we have a number of projects in, through my institute in Norway as well as from the ILRI here. And one of the big projects we have is what we call ECRA, that is for the accelerating impacts of CGR climate research in Africa. So with this, we partner, for example, with national partners such as the Ethiopian Meteorological Institute, Ministry of Agriculture, the Institute for Agricultural Research at a national level, but also we have regional and continental partners that work with us very closely. For example, the IGAD Climate Prediction Center, who has been really giving forecasts, specifically seasonal forecasts for the region. It's called IGPAC. We work very closely with them. And then there are offices here in Addis. The World Meteorological Regional Office is located here in Addis, and also the African Climate Policy Center, which is at UNECA. These are key partners for us when it comes to coordinating our work towards, achieving the goals that each of these institutes set nationally, regionally, and continentally as well.
So would you share me the observation you have had on the efforts of Ethiopia to mitigate climate change?
Well, there has been quite a lot of work on mitigation, and one of the reasons why we, like I said before, one of the reasons why we have been so affected by climate change is because of our low adaptation capacity. Many of the developing countries have a very low adaptive capacity to these changes. So, but on the other hand, on the mitigation, there are quite many efforts to curb the greenhouse gas emission in the country. I think the initiative that has been currently going on Green Legacy is one of the examples that can be mentioned in this area.
What is your take on the magnitude of the problem and the urgency of remedial intervention is?
I think the magnitude of the problem has been observed globally, and that's why there are a number of initiatives. We could mention the Paris Agreement on 2015 that international communities has gathered and have agreed to make some changes on greenhouse gas emissions. The cases where 196 countries have signed, for example, this agreement. That tells you that the magnitude of the problem is observed globally. And when it comes to nationally, I think there has been quite many efforts to really combat the impacts of climate change in the country. Mitigation is one of the ways to really address this, and emissions that comes from the livestock, such as methane and others, they have been monitored by many institutions, including the International Livestock Research Institute.
Well, so what is your final remark regarding on the events you have seen regarding the climate change and variability, and also the consequences? And you can just include the early warning systems as a part of the solution. So what remarks would you like to make?
When it comes to early warning, it's we are talking about now a short time scale, a different time scale. Because one impact of climate change is, disrupting the seasonal patterns, and there is high interannual variability, so that we could not be easily able to predict what is coming in the next season. So the UN has, in the COP meeting, they stated that every human being is entitled to get early warning information within the next 5 years, meaning by 2027, people are entitled to get those information. So for that, they have what they call a new initiative called Early Warning for All. And this has 4 pillars. And one is on the risk management, meaning knowing the risk, like I said before, which areas have more risk. The second one is on monitoring and observing and forecasting, to improve the forecasting, for example, the seasonal forecast, and so on. The third one is risk communication and dissemination, because whatever information you have, if that is not communicated to the right users, then it's no more useful at all. So this is one of the areas. I think the media actually plays a very big role in ensuring that those informations are reaching to the users, because this has been one of the big gaps that has been observed when it comes to early warning. Because a good example I could give you is many of the centers, regional climate centers, and even the national, the Ethiopian Meteorological Institute, have predicted well ahead of time what's going to happen in the Borana and other regions. Okay? The drought was predicted well ahead of time in these regions. But the question was why those early warning was not followed by early action. Was there no any preparedness, or what was the issue? That's why the 4 pillars in the Early Warning for All initiative focuses on preparedness and responses, or what they call it anticipatory action. So if we have a very strengthened anticipatory action system, so that whatever early warning information we have given, that will be followed by early action, so that we will be able to save lives, properties, and so on. So now, the expectation is that this initiative that has been already started by the World Meteorological Organization will be adopted by countries. But countries are doing very well. For example, the Ethiopian Meteorological Institute so far has been really doing very well. And the forecast, I work with them very closely, has improved significantly the last few years. So I think media and all other stakeholders, for example, the agriculture, the water, and the health and other sectors that are affected by climate, needs to work very closely with these centers. Of course, there is what they call it a national framework for climate services. So this is endorsed in Ethiopia. 6 ministries have already signed. The Ministry of Agriculture, Water, Disaster Risk Management Commission, Ethiopian Meteorological Institute, and so on. The idea is, how can we use that information for our sectors? So, but I think at least we need to work more on the implementation side of it. The agreement has been signed, and before every season comes, for example, the Ethiopian Meteorological Organization Institute now gathers all the different stakeholders, and they call it the National Climate Outlook Forum. So before every season comes, for example, before Krampt comes, all the stakeholders from these centers will be gathered 1 month ahead of time and look into the forecast, and the centers or the stakeholders from the Ministry of Agriculture and others would look into the impact of that forecast on their sectors. So this has been a practice that has been going on for the last few years.
That's nice. And my final point, Dr. Teferi, is the contribution of the Ethiopian Green Legacy Initiative implementation for mitigating climate change here in the region and beyond.
This is a great initiative, and as we know, tree planting or planting any kinds of plants has quite a big advantage for a number of things. And one advantage is, for example, it protects soil erosion. And many areas, especially the highland areas in Ethiopia, are highly affected by soil erosion. So this would have a big benefit when it comes to soil erosion. Another advantage, like we said earlier, one impact of climate change is on agriculture, and agriculture on food security. So if we are planting nutritious food and other things, then the impact would be, we would have, that would help the food security in the country. So if we are planting mangoes and all other kinds of fruits and vegetables, that has also impact on the food security in the country. And another advantage is it changes the microclimate as well. For example, now you are in Ilori compound, you see a number of trees around, and you can feel how good the environment is in this area. So it changes the microclimate of the region significantly as well. But when it comes to the climate change, we said, for example, that the changes on the greenhouse gases, particularly on the CO2, it changes very gradually. Of course, now, so at the same time, the impact of it is also seen in a very gradual manner, even though we witness such changes currently. So the things that we do now will definitely have impact in the future, say in 10 years to come, and so on. And I'm sure that if many countries adopt this and continue to plant trees, because these are sinks for CO2 or the carbon dioxide. So the more trees we have in the globally, and the more sinks are there. So whatever is produced as emission on the CO2, if there is some kind of balance on sinks, then that would help us. But I think this is not the only solution, because countries need to abide by the agreement they signed to reduce emissions. But at the same time, such initiatives would counteract to those emissions. And this is a great initiative that Ethiopia has started. I think this is an initiative that needs to be, expanded to many other countries, I would say.
Okay. Well, that's really very nice. And one thing that must be related with this one, and you need to react here, is that what if the global institutions that are just working on climate change, environment, and related areas need to do to help or just to assist Ethiopia's cause?
Well, there are three key areas according to the agreement that was signed on the Paris Agreement on 2015. The three areas that one country should do for the other, especially developed countries needs to do for the developing countries, is one is the issue of finance, okay? Especially developing countries who are vulnerable to climate change needs the support from the developed countries who have been so far responsible for the emission of those greenhouse gases. So that is one of the areas where supposed to be implemented. The second area is on knowledge transfer, because a number of innovations are there, to help the reduction of greenhouse gases, and that needs to be also transferred. The last part, according to the agreement, was more on capacity building. So this was supposed to be which one country should help to the other. So with the support of the finance and innovations and the capacity building, such kind of big initiatives could be easily adopted to other countries as well.
Well, Dr. Teferi Dejene, thank you so much for joining ETV Special Edition and just giving your insights, explanations, expertise, knowledge, and experience on the climate change in Eastern Africa as well as in Ethiopia and what measures need to be taken. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Dear viewers, this has been the conversation with Dr. Teferi Dejene, who is a senior researcher here at International Livestock Research Institute and also at Norway Climate Research Center. Thank you so much for joining us again, and we have just talked about a lot of issues, particularly climate change and variability and its consequences on the Eastern African region and what measures need to be taken in order to have boosted or maximized agricultural production and productivity. Thank you so much for staying with us again. I'm Sintayo Tamrat with this special edition. See you another time.